All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into something that I think a lot of our listeners can relate to, and that is that feeling of anxiety before a coding interview.
Oh, for sure.
Especially when you're, trying to land a job at one of those big tech companies,
Yeah.
like those FA companies everyone talks about.
Right.
And to help us out today, we're going to be looking at an article that a listener sent in,
Okay.
and it's called "Managing Stress and Anxiety Before the Interview."
Okay.
And it's from the Algo Academy blog.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a topic that I know I've certainly felt that anxiety
Yeah.
before, and I'm sure a lot of other people have too.
Oh, yeah. For sure.
And luckily, we have an expert here with us today to help us sort of break this down and hopefully give us some strategies for dealing with this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting because a lot of the same anxieties that come up, thinking about those big FA interviews
Yeah.
can also apply to, any interview, really.
Yeah, it's true.
So I think there's some good universal stuff here.
So what are some of those things that cause us to feel anxious before an interview?
Well, the article talks about a few key things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the biggest ones is just uh, fear of the unknown, right?
That makes sense.
You're stepping into a situation where there are a lot of variables you can't control.
Right.
You don't know who you're going to be talking to. You don't know exactly what questions they're going to ask you.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't know what the format of the interview is going to be like.
Right.
And so all of that can really contribute to a feeling of anxiety.
Yeah, for sure.
Another big one is just that pressure to perform, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you know that these jobs are highly competitive.
Yeah.
And there's a lot at stake. You really, really want this job.
Right.
So that can definitely add to the pressure.
And I think for a lot of coders in particular, there's that the imposter syndrome.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a really common one, where you feel like, maybe I'm not as good as people think I am.
Uh-huh.
Maybe I'm going to get found out as a fraud.
Right. Right.
And that can be really debilitating, especially in a high pressure situation like a coding interview.
So I think a big takeaway there is that we're not alone in this.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
A lot of times, we experience these feelings and we think we're the only ones.
Right.
But the truth is that this is a really common experience.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think just knowing that, you're not alone in this can be really helpful.
And the article has some practical advice for how to deal with this anxiety.
It does, yeah, it really emphasizes the importance of preparation.
Okay.
And they break it down into sort of three core areas.
Hmm.
Um, you've got your technical skills, you've got your knowledge of common interview questions, and then you've got your research into the company itself.
So it's not just about the code.
Right.
It's also about the soft skills
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
knowing about the company and the role
Yeah.
that you're interviewing for.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people when they think about the technical preparation,
Yeah.
they kind of fall into this trap of thinking, "Oh, I just need to like memorize a bunch of algorithms."
Right.
Like if I can just like regurgitate these
Yeah.
algorithms on demand, I'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
It's really about like understanding the underlying principles behind those algorithms.
Yeah.
Developing like that problem-solving muscle memory.
Yeah.
Like being able to think critically about a problem
Right.
and come up with solutions on the fly.
Yeah.
It's not just about being able to spit out code from memory.
It's like training for a marathon.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just show up on the day of the marathon and expect to be able to run it
Right.
if you hadn't done any training.
You've got to put in the work.
Yeah.
You've got to build up that stamina, that endurance.
And the article actually gives an example of a coding question that they say is a pretty common one, called the twosome function.
Right. Yeah. The classic twosome problem.
Yeah. So for those of us who may not be like, hardcore algorithms people, could you explain that a little bit?
So basically, the twosome problem is, you're given an array of numbers.
Okay.
And you're given a target value.
Okay.
And you need to find the two numbers in that array that add up to that target value.
Okay.
So let's say, for example, your target is 10,
Mm-hmm.
and you have an array of numbers like 2, 7, and 15. So the simplest approach would be to just like check every possible pair of numbers
Right.
and see if they add up to 10.
Yeah.
But that can be pretty inefficient,
Right.
especially if you have a very large array.
Especially with a large array.
Right.
Yeah.
So that the more optimized approach would be to use something like a hash table,
Okay.
where you can store the values that you've seen
Mm-hmm.
and then quickly check for their complements.
Right.
So you can solve it in linear time rather than quadratic time.
So basically the point of the example is that it's not just about getting the right answer.
Right.
It's about showing your thought process.
Yeah.
Showing how you can take a problem
Exactly.
and break it down.
It's about showing like how you think,
Yeah.
how you approach problems, and that's really what interviewers are looking for.
And then you mentioned the research into the company itself.
Yeah.
So why is that important?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that it shows the interviewer that you're genuinely interested in the company and the role.
Right.
That you've taken the time to learn about what they do,
Yeah.
and what their values are,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're not just applying to every job under the sun,
Right. Right.
but that you've specifically chosen to apply into this job because you're interested in what they're doing.
It shows that you're not just desperate
Right.
for any job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that can make a big difference.
So this research can it also help you, with your anxiety?
I think so. Yeah. I think it can help you feel more prepared,
Yeah.
and more confident going into the interview.
And it also kind of shifts the power dynamic a little bit too, right?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah. It's not just you trying to please the interviewer.
Right.
It's also you evaluating them
Right.
to see if they're a good fit for you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important shifting perspective to have,
Yeah.
because it takes some of that pressure off of you,
Mm-hmm.
and it allows you to go into the interview feeling more like an equal.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Okay, so far we've talked about being prepared,
Right.
both technically and doing our research on the company.
Yeah.
But let's be real, sometimes even if we're totally prepared,
Absolutely.
the nerves can still get to us.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And the article talks about some mindfulness and relaxation techniques that can be helpful.
Yeah, they might sound a little bit woo-woo.
Yeah.
But there's actually some good science behind them.
I've always been a little bit skeptical of these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to be convinced.
Yeah.
So what's the logic behind these techniques?
Okay, well, think about what happens when we get anxious. Right? Our body goes into this like fight or flight mode.
Right.
Right. Our heart rate increases.
Yeah.
Our breathing becomes shallow.
Right.
Our focus narrows.
Yeah.
And so these mindfulness techniques are really about trying to counteract that physiological response.
Okay.
So things like deep breathing exercises,
Yes.
where you slow down your breathing, you focus on your breath.
Right.
That can help to slow down your heart rate,
Okay.
kind of calm your nervous system down.
It's like hitting the reset button.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Visualization can be another helpful technique.
Right.
Where you kind of imagine yourself
Mm-hmm.
going through the interview successfully.
Right.
And that can help to build your confidence
Right.
and reduce your anxiety.
And there's that the power posing thing
Yeah.
that I've heard about.
The power posing.
But that sounds a little silly to me.
I know. It sounds a little silly.
So you're telling me that if I stand like Superman.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to like wear a cape or anything.
Okay.
But yeah, the idea is that by adopting these expansive postures,
Mm-hmm.
you can actually like change your hormonal profile.
Okay.
You can increase your testosterone levels,
Wow.
which are associated with confidence
Okay.
and dominance.
Okay.
And you can decrease your cortisol levels,
Okay.
which is the stress hormone.
All right. So there's actually
So it's not just about, like feeling good.
Yeah.
It's actually about like changing your body chemistry.
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to try that one.
I encourage you to.
All right. Well, this has been really insightful so far.
Good.
I'm definitely feeling a little bit less anxious already.
That's great.
So we've talked about the preparation. We've talked about these mindfulness and relaxation techniques.
Yeah.
But what about those of us who tend to just freeze up in the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Even if we're prepared and we've done all the right things.
Yeah.
We get into that interview room and our mind goes blank.
Right.
The article talks about mock interviews as a solution.
They do, yeah.
So how can those help us?
Well, I think mock interviews are really valuable for a couple of reasons.
Okay.
One is that they help you to get comfortable with the format of the interview.
Right.
You kind of know what to expect.
Yeah.
You've been through the experience before.
Yeah.
So it's not as nerve-wracking.
It's like a dress rehearsal.
Exactly.
Right, for the real thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that they help you to identify your strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
You can see what you're good at
Mm-hmm.
and what you need to work on.
Right.
And that can help you to focus your preparation
Yeah.
so that you're really ready for the real thing.
And the article mentions a couple of different ways to do mock interviews.
Yeah.
One is to practice with peers, other coders that you know.
Yeah.
And then there are also online platforms where
Great.
you can do mock interviews with, people who are
Yeah.
professionals.
Yeah. There are a lot of great online platforms these days
Yeah.
that offer mock interview services.
And what are some of the pros and cons of each approach?
Well, I think peer practice is great because it's free
Right.
and it's easy to do. You can just grab a friend
Yeah.
and run through some questions together.
Right.
The downside is that the quality of feedback can vary a lot
Yeah.
depending on how experienced your peer is,
Right.
and how good they are at giving feedback.
And if they're actually a good interviewer.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas with the online platforms, you're typically getting feedback from someone who's more experienced,
Mm-hmm.
and who's trained in giving feedback on interviews.
Right.
But of course, that comes at a cost. Those platforms usually charge a fee.
So the online platforms might be better if you're looking for more sort of technical feedback
Yeah,
on your coding skills.
yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Whereas the peer practice might be better for practicing those softer skills, like,
Mhm.
how to tell your story
Yeah,
and how to, communicate your passion for the job.
yeah, and how to build rapport with the interviewer, which
Yeah.
is really important.
Right.
You want to make sure that you're coming across as someone who's likable
Yeah.
and who they would want to work with.
And I think a lot of that comes down to just being authentic. Right?
Absolutely.
Like not trying to be someone that you're not and
Right.
just being yourself.
Right. I think authenticity is really key.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that interviewers can really sense.
Mhm.
They can tell if you're being genuine or if you're putting on a show.
Right.
And so I think it's really important to just be yourself
Right.
and to let your personality shine through.
And I think that's something that can actually help with the anxiety as well.
Yeah. Right.
If you're not trying to be someone that you're not, then
Right.
you're not going to be as worried about
Exactly.
messing up.
Yeah. It takes some of the pressure off.
Yeah.
For sure.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have.
We've talked about, the importance of preparation. We've talked about some mindfulness and relaxation techniques. We've talked about mock interviews. And I think the big takeaway here is that, there are things that we can do
Absolutely.
to manage this anxiety
Yeah.
and to feel more confident going into these interviews.
And it's not something that you have to just suffer through.
Right.
There are things that you can do to take control.
And it's a skill that you can learn.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like anything else. The more you practice it,
Mm-hmm.
the better you'll get at it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
And when we come back, we're going to be talking about something that I think is really fascinating,
Okay.
which is the power of mindset
Yeah.
and how that can affect your performance in an interview.
I'm looking forward to that.
All right. We'll be right back. All right. So we're back and, we were talking about mock interviews and how they can be helpful for practicing for these coding interviews. But the article also touches on this idea of mindset
Yes.
and how important that is.
Right.
And they talk a lot about cultivating this growth mindset.
Yeah.
But I'll admit I'm always a little bit wary of these kinds of buzzwords.
Sure.
Because they can sometimes feel a little bit vague.
Right.
So what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
In the context of a coding interview.
So I think the key here is to try to shift your perspective.
Okay.
Instead of viewing these interviews as like a pass-fail test,
Right.
where you either get the job or you
Wow.
don't try to see them as valuable learning experiences,
Okay.
regardless of the outcome.
So even if you don't get the job,
Yeah,
you can still learn something from the experience.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's really important because, a lot of times
Yeah.
we put so much pressure on ourselves
Mm-hmm.
to get the job
Right.
that we forget that there's value in the process itself.
So instead of beating ourselves up over every mistake.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay to make mistakes.
Right.
I think that's another important thing to remember.
Yeah.
Everyone makes mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And the important thing is to learn from them.
So how do we reframe those mistakes
Yeah.
as opportunities for growth?
Well, I think it's about trying to see them as feedback. Like, okay, so I made this mistake.
Yeah.
What can I learn from this?
Mm-hmm.
How can I do better next time?
And that kind of ties back into the growth mindset, right?
It does, yeah.
Because it's about, not seeing yourself as,
Yeah.
having a fixed set of abilities,
Right.
but rather seeing your abilities as something that can be developed.
Right. It's about believing that you can always improve,
Right.
that you can always learn new things.
And I think that's especially important in a field like tech,
Yeah.
where everything is constantly changing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the technology landscape is evolving so rapidly
Right.
that if you're not constantly learning,
Right.
you could get left behind.
Yeah. So this mindset is not just about, feeling good.
Right.
It's also about, actually being successful in your career.
I think that's right, yeah.
Okay. So this growth mindset can help us to manage our anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
but can it also actually improve our performance in the interview?
I think so, yeah.
How so?
Well, I think when you're not so focused on the outcome,
Right.
whether you get the job or not,
Right.
you're able to relax more.
Yeah.
You're able to think more clearly.
Right.
And you're able to just be yourself.
Right. You're not as worried about messing up.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think all of that can lead to a better performance.
Because you're not letting those nerves kind of sabotage you.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The nerves can really get in the way sometimes.
Yeah. And the article makes this really good point about remembering that your worth isn't tied to a single interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's so important.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in that.
Yeah.
Especially when you've been, going through a lot of interviews
Yeah.
and you're feeling rejected.
Right.
Yeah.
It can be really easy to start to feel like, oh, there's something wrong with me.
Right. I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that that's not true.
And that this one interview isn't going to make or break your career.
Right, exactly.
Right.
It's just one data point
Yeah.
in a much larger picture.
I like to think of it as like building XP in a video game.
Okay.
Yeah. Like even if you don't level up
Right.
for a particular interview,
Right.
you're still gaining experience points.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to think about it.
That are going to make you a stronger candidate in the long run.
Yeah, you're building your skill set.
Right.
You're learning from your mistakes.
Yeah.
You're becoming more resilient.
Yeah. So even if you don't get the job offer,
Right.
it's not a total loss.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. That's really helpful.
Good.
And I think another important part of this mindset shift
Yeah.
is recognizing that you have something valuable to offer,
Mm,
even if you don't feel like the perfect candidate.
right.
Because it's so easy to.
Yeah. It's so easy to compare ourselves to others.
Right.
And feel like we're not good enough.
Especially with social media and everything.
Oh yeah.
You see everyone's highlight reel.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel like everyone else has it all figured out,
Right.
and you're the only one who's struggling.
Right.
But the truth is that everyone's struggling.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own challenges.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to just focus on what you bring to the table
Right.
and to be confident in your abilities.
So how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we combat that feeling of inadequacy?
Well, I think one thing that can be helpful is to remind yourself why you were invited to the interview in the first place.
Okay.
Like the company saw something in your resume.
Right.
They saw something in your skills.
Yeah.
They saw something in your experience
Right.
that made them want to talk to you.
So they see something in you. Yeah.
So try to focus on that.
On what you bring to the table.
Yeah, focus on your strengths.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to talk about your accomplishments.
Right.
You've earned those accomplishments,
Mhm.
so be proud of them.
It's not bragging.
Right, it's not bragging.
It's just, yeah.
It's It's about presenting yourself in the best possible light
Right.
and letting the interviewer know what you have to offer.
And I think that can also tie into the idea of, showing up authentically.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, I think authenticity is really important.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that interviewers can really sense.
Right. They can tell if you're being fake.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to just be yourself.
And I think when you're being authentic,
Yeah.
it takes some of the pressure off.
Right.
Because you're not trying to.
You're not trying to be someone you're not.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's really key.
All right. Well, this has been really helpful.
Yeah.
I think I'm starting to get a better understanding of this whole mindset thing.
Right.
But what about the actual technical questions?
Yeah.
Because we can have the right mindset,
Right.
but we still need to be able to solve the problems.
Absolutely.
So what are some practical tips
Yeah.
for navigating those tricky coding challenges?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And that's something that we're going to dive into
Okay.
in part 3.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. So we're back and ready to tackle part 3 of our deep dive.
Yeah.
All about conquering those coding interview nerves.
Right.
Now, we've talked about, preparation and mindset,
Mm-hmm.
but now it's time to get into the actual nitty-gritty of solving those technical questions.
Yeah. Let's get into it.
The ones that you get in the interview room
Right.
that can really make or break your interview. So any tips for how to actually, approach those problems?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that, it's okay to feel some pressure
Right.
when you're put on the spot like that.
Yeah.
But it's important to try to reframe that pressure as excitement. Like, this is my chance to show what I can do.
Yeah.
And to remember that the interviewer is not trying to trick you.
Right.
They're not trying to make you fail.
Right.
They're actually rooting for you to succeed.
Okay.
Because they want to find someone who can do the job.
Right. They're trying to fill a position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So try to keep that in mind.
So it's not like a pop quiz in school,
Right.
where they're,
Exactly.
they're just trying to see if you've memorized the material.
No, it's not about that.
Okay.
It's really about seeing how you think.
Yeah.
How you approach problems, how you solve problems.
So it's more about the process than just getting the right answer.
Exactly. The process is just as important as the outcome.
Okay. So how can we showcase that process in the interview?
So one thing that the article recommends is to ask clarifying question.
Okay.
If you're not sure what the interviewer is asking,
Mm-hmm.
or if you need more information,
Yeah.
don't be afraid to ask for clarification.
Okay.
It shows that you're thoughtful, that you're paying attention,
Right.
that you're not just rushing into a solution without fully understanding the problem.
Yeah. You're not just trying to show off,
Right.
that you know everything already.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the problem before you try to solve it.
It's like before you set out on a trip, you want to make sure you have the right directions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you don't just start driving without knowing where you're going.
Right. You want to make sure you have a good map
Right.
and that you know how to read it.
Yeah.
So yeah, asking clarifying questions is a great way to start.
Okay, and then once you have a good understanding of the problem,
Mm-hmm.
what's next?
So the next step is to start thinking out loud.
Talk through your thought process.
Exactly.
Even if it feels a little bit messy.
Yeah, even if it's messy, even if you're not sure where you're going with it.
Okay, so why is that helpful?
Well, for a couple of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it helps you to organize your own thoughts.
Okay.
When you have to verbalize what you're thinking,
Boy.
it forces you to to put it into words.
To structure it a little bit.
Yeah, and that can help you to see things more clearly.
Okay.
And then it also helps the interviewer to understand your thought process.
Okay.
Yeah, they can see how you're approaching the problem.
Yeah.
They can see what steps you're taking.
Right.
And that can be really valuable even if you don't end up getting the right answer.
So it's like you're inviting them into your brain.
Yeah, exactly.
As you're working through the problem.
You're letting them see the gears turning.
Yeah, and I guess that can also help to build rapport with the interviewer.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, it shows that you're confident enough to share your thought process,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not perfect.
Right.
And it also shows that you're open to feedback.
Right. And you're not afraid to be wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a really important quality to have, especially in a technical role.
Okay, so we're thinking out loud. We're working through the problem. But what if we get stuck?
Yeah, that happens.
That's probably going to happen.
It happens to everyone.
Yeah, what do we do then?
So the first thing is, don't panic.
Okay, easier said than done.
I know, it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
But it's really important to try to stay calm.
Right.
Because the more anxious you get,
Yeah.
the harder it's going to be to think clearly.
Yeah. It's like your brain just shuts down.
Exactly. So take a deep breath, recenter yourself,
Okay.
and then try to break the problem down into smaller pieces.
Okay, so try to make it more manageable.
Yeah, try to simplify it as much as possible.
Okay.
And then if you're still stuck, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Okay.
You can say something like, I'm not sure where to go from here. Can you give me a hint?
So it's okay to admit that you don't know something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody knows everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much better to ask for help than to just sit there and flounder.
Because the interviewer probably has seen this a million times before.
They have, yeah.
So they're not going to be surprised if you get stuck.
No, they're not going to be surprised at all.
Yeah.
In fact, they're probably expecting it.
And they might even have some tips for how to approach the problem.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Okay, so we've talked about what to do when you're in the interview room, but what about after the interview? How do we deal with that post-interview anxiety?
So I think one of the best things you can do is to just try to let it go.
Okay.
You've done your best.
Mm-hmm.
You've prepared as much as you could.
Right.
You've gone in there and you've given it your all.
Yeah.
And now it's out of your hands.
It's up to them.
It's up to them.
Yeah.
So try not to dwell on it.
Yeah.
Try not to overanalyze everything you said.
Yeah.
And everything you did.
Just move on.
Just move on.
Yeah. Okay.
Focus on the next thing.
All right. Well, I think this has been a really, really helpful deep dive.
Good. I'm glad.
I know I've learned a lot.
Good.
And I hope our listeners have too.
You too.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would just say, to everyone out there who's going through the coding interview process.
Yeah.
Just remember that you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone gets nervous.
Yeah.
Everyone makes mistakes.
Yeah.
But the important thing is to just keep learning, to keep growing.
Yeah.
And to never give up on your dreams.
And to remember that this one interview isn't going to make or break your career.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just one step along the way.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you found this deep dive helpful.
Hope so.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.